Well, thank you for being here. I'm really glad that you've come. Let's open with a word of prayer. Lord, every day we are reminded, either by what we hear about in the lives of others or by what we experience in our own lives, that this is a life which, in spite of its many joys, wonders, delights, is in a world broken by sin, given ultimately to sorrows. And yet the greater the sorrows, the greater we find the victories, the greater the turmoil, the greater the conquest, as you deliver all that you have promised and even more. And so we look ahead, O God, to the things you'll continue to do in our lives, the great joys that we will experience as we see you at work, and finally, consummately, in the day when you return, when all things are set right, when this world and the heavens and the earth are burned with fire and a new heaven and earth descend from you, on that day, O God, our rejoicing will be forever full, in accord, Lord, with what you designed from the very beginning. We pray these things in Christ's name. Amen. All right, we're in Judges chapter 15, continuing this saga of this man, Samson. Very interesting.
Like Bible?
Yes, we do need Bibles. Thank you, Peter. I didn't think of Nathan, why don't you help him? Just grab a few Bibles for everybody. No, we need a couple other verses to look up. I'm glad that he thought of that. Okay. So, we might even finish early. Who knows? I'm always optimistic. Yeah, let's go ahead and read this story. Later on, at the time of wheat harvest, Samson took a young goat and went to visit his wife. He said, "I'm going to my wife's room," but her father would not let him go in. "I was so sure you hated her," he said, "that I gave her to your companion. Isn't her younger sister more attractive? Take her instead." Samson said to them, "This time I have a right to get even with the Philistines. I will really harm them." So he went out and caught 300 foxes and tied them tail to tail in pairs. He then fastened a torch to every pair of tails, lit the torches, and let the foxes loose in the standing grain of the Philistines. He burned up the shocks and standing grain together with the vineyards and olive groves. When the Philistines asked, "Who did this?" they were told, "Samson, the Timnite's son-in-law, because his wife was given to his companion." So the Philistines went up and burned her and her father to death. Samson said to them, "Since you've acted like this, I swear that I won't stop until I get my revenge on you." He attacked them viciously and slaughtered many of them. Then he went down and stayed in a cave in the rock of Etam. The Philistines went up and camped in Judah, spreading out near Lehi. The people of Judah asked, "Why have you come to fight us?" "We've come to take Samson prisoner," they asked, "to do to him as he did to us." Then 3,000 men from Judah went down to the cave in the rock of Etam and said to Samson, "Don't you realize that the Philistines are rulers over us? What have you done to us?" He answered, "I merely did to them what they did to me." They said to him, "We've come to tie you up and hand you over to the Philistines." Samson said, "Swear to me that you won't kill me yourselves." "Agreed," they answered. "We will only tie you up and hand you over to them. We will not kill you." So they bound him with 2 new ropes and led him up from the rock. As he approached Lehi, the Philistines came toward him, shouting. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. The ropes on his arms became like charred flax, and the bindings dropped from his hands. Finding a fresh jawbone of a donkey, he grabbed it and struck down 1,000 men. Then Samson said, "With a donkey's jawbone I have made donkeys of them. With a donkey's jawbone I have killed 1,000 men." When he finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone, and the place was called Ramath Lehi. Because he was very thirsty, he cried out to the Lord, "You have given your servant this great victory. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" Then God opened up the hollow place in Lehi, and water came out of it. And Samson drank, his strength returned, and he revived. So the spring was called En-Hakkore, and it is still there in Lehi. Samson led Israel for 20 years in the days of the Philistines. All right. So another interesting story, interesting stuff from Samson, isn't it? Oh, you need one of those. Sorry, does anyone else need one of these papers? Everybody get one? Okay. All right, so what we're seeing here, I think, first of all, is a pattern that we should notice. What was the pattern that you saw in the last chapter? Think about the last chapter, what we did last week. What were patterns that you saw there?
The Israelites fell into sin.
Yeah. So they're right. So the cycle was
Yes.
happening. Right. We'll look at that again. What else? I called attention to two words that popped up again and again in last week's study. Does anyone remember? Remember, went down. Samson went down.
Oh, yeah.
Things kept going down, down. And it's a travel reference. Going down meant traveling from one place to another, a place of higher elevation to a place of lower elevation. But it also carries the same connotation that we would, for example, in our English, of things kind of going downhill. So we might even say something like that today. So if you've got, let's say, a business deal and it's going bad, things are falling apart, you say, oh, that thing sure went south. Well, you don't mean that the business deal is now being handled in Tennessee, right? You mean that it's falling apart, right? It's going downhill. So Samson was going downhill, you could say, morally, or in terms of his character. Things were getting worse and worse for Samson. And you're seeing a pattern here in this chapter that kind of reflects something on that, in the sense that every time things get worse, what does God do? God brings about a greater victory. He does something even more extraordinary. So I have them down, like, look about a quarter of the way up from the bottom of the page. And I have some examples here. So Samson meets a lion. Remember that? He's traveling and he runs into a lion. Have you met any lions lately? Probably scare you. You'd be walking along, all of a sudden a lion jumps out of the bushes. But what happened out of his encounter with the lion? The Spirit of God came upon him and he killed the lion, tore it apart. And then what happened when he came back and saw the lion later? Yeah, the bees had made honey in it. So out of the lion, something bad, what happens? He made the poem, something sweet, or the riddle of it. Out of the lion, something sweet. And then he has the riddle last week, and he tells the men at the Philistine wedding ceremony there, hey, if you can answer my riddle, I'll give you 30 suits of clothes. And they can't answer the riddle, and so what do? Remembers?
Threatened his wife.
Yeah, they went to his wife and put pressure on her to coax the answer out of him, and they finally she convinced him, and he gave up the answer, and they figured out the riddle. So something bad happened. He was kind of coaxed and coerced into explaining, but what came out of it? Where did he get the clothes from?
The Philistines.
Yeah, that's right. He didn't go in his closet. He went to Ashkelon and killed 30 Philistines. And now here in our story today, remember he went back with his father at the end of last week's lesson. And so we learned that the father of his wife gave the woman to be the wife of one of the 30 men, one of his companions at the ceremony. So now here comes Samson back, and he brings a young goat, and he goes to visit his wife. And look, there's not much left to the imagination, is it? He knocks on the door. His father-in-law answers, and he says, here's a goat. I brought you for a present. I'm going in my wife's room to visit her. And that's when he finds out that the woman has been given as a husband to somebody else. And he's really upset by that. So now what happens as a result of that? He ties the torches to the foxes' tails. And they go running through all the fields and everything. And so you can imagine, right, two foxes tied together, that's probably not going to work well, right? They don't like that. And then on top of it, they've got the torch tied to them. And so what's going on? They're pulling and running every which way. It's all crazy and herky-jerky, right? They're all over the place. And the foxes, I'm curious. I don't know if these are actual foxes, or I discovered when I went to Iraq that in the Near East, they often call jackals foxes. So maybe these were jackals, I don't know. But out of the fact that his wife was given to somebody else, he ends up burning all the fields of the Philistines. So now what did the Philistines do? They come and they are upset that this happened. They learn why it happened. And so as revenge on the father-in-law, they burn down his house, kill him, and they kill Samson's wife. Now what becomes of that? Samson, verse 8. He attacked them viciously and slaughtered many of them. So we don't even know how many. But they kill his wife. He kills a bunch more Philistines. Now they make war. They said they're gonna attack Judah, try to get Samson. And so the people of Judah find out why they're there. They go to Samson and say, "Hey, come with us." And he makes them promise that they won't kill him. Isn't that kind of a crazy thing, you know? Promise that you won't kill me. Oh no, we're just going to tie you up, and we'll give you to that. We'll give you to big Joe Rudimenti, the mafia boss here. We're not going to do anything to you, right? So now he gets tied up, and he's a prisoner. But what comes out of that?
The Spirit of the Lord comes down.
The Spirit of the Lord comes on him. He takes the jawbone, and now he kills 1,000. And then in next week's lesson, I hope you can be here next week, we'll have the story of Samson and Delilah. He ends up marrying another Philistine woman. And as a result of that relationship, he gets captured by the Philistines and they gouge out his eyes. But what does God do in reaction to that? Remember the story? Yeah,
he still gets his strength returned.
Yeah, his hair grows back, his strength comes back, pushes the columns and kills 3,000. So what I want you to see here is something bad happens, so God brings a victory. Something worse happens, God brings a bigger victory. Something worse happens, God brings a bigger victory. And something worse happens, and God brings a bigger victory. Do you see the pattern here of what's happening? Every time something worse or something bad happens to Samson here, God does something even more extraordinary to bring destruction to the Philistines who are oppressing his people. What kind of story do you think that might send to people today, or to you? What do you get out of that?
Well, I think even though Samson made so many errors, you couldn't call him godly. I mean, in much of a way, and yet God still worked through him to bring about his purpose of bringing down the Philistines. Even after all that Samson did, Samson cried out for water. Must I die of thirst? And God still provided him with water. Even though I would look at Samson and kind of want to shake my head and say, yikes, what are you doing? But God still worked through him, even in ways that don't make sense, in ways that we don't understand. But he still brought his purpose of judgment and things to the Philistines.
Yeah, that's the larger overarching message of the whole story. And the fact that the worse things get, the more mightily God acts, and the greater the consequences that God brings about against the Philistines. Doesn't that let us know in our situation that the greater our crisis, the greater our problem, the greater our dilemma, more mightily God can bring victory. So when we experience things, we all have little ups and downs every day. We all experience God doing things in our lives every day. But when you have that really terrible thing go happen in your family or in your health, or in your finances, or in your well-being, or your relationships, or whatever it is, the worse those things are, part of the message I think we should take away from that is the greater God's ultimate activity is going to be when he brings about the final end, the final outcome. What is the worst thing that ever happened in all of history, with all of human suffering, all of the problems that people have ever experienced? What of all things is the worst?
Crucifixion.
I think so, yeah. You know, you think like, wow, the Holocaust, that's terrible. Racial, ethnic cleansing, millions of people being killed, that's terrible. It is, and I'm not diminishing it in any way, but that the Son of God, that the only one in the world who was perfect and righteous and perfectly pleased the Father, the only one that could raise people from the dead and heal the sick and bring about good and turn everything around to the better, that he should be crucified. What is worse than that? And yet, here's my second question. Of all the things that have ever happened in human history, what is the greatest thing that ever happened?
His ascension.
Crucifixion.
That he was crucified, right? Because out of his crucifixion, God brought forgiveness of sins and life and healing and redemption. So do you see that pattern there? That the worse things are for you, the greater the thing that God will accomplish in your life. I think this is valuable for facing bad things in our lives. If I ever do the theology of suffering class, I don't know if I'll ever get to it or not, but if we ever get to do that, part of the reason for doing that class is because what you think about suffering before you go through it tremendously affects how you go through it. So if you've just grown up with the idea that nothing bad really should ever happen to me, bad things only happen to other people, and then something terrible happens, those are the people that are all torn apart. I mean, everybody suffers and hurts when something bad happens, but those are the ones that can't function, that completely lose it. If, on the other hand, you go through life and you say, no, I should expect bad things are going to happen in this world. And one of these days, I'm going to lose my health, or I'm going to lose my loved one, or something terrible is going to happen, but God has promised that I'll be more than a conqueror through Jesus Christ. And God will bring me the final victory. God will one day give back all and more to his children. Then when it hits you, you have a coping mechanism. You have the floor is pulled out from under you, but you don't keep falling because you've got a foundation under there. So having this understanding, this mindset that the worse things are in your life, the more powerfully God will bring about his purposes for good in your life in the end. That is, I think, very useful. And that's what we see being displayed here in the life of Samson, right? Every time something happens and gets worse, God uses it to do something better and for his purpose. All right, back in chapter 13, one of the things, the first chapter that we looked at the story of Samson, one of the things we noticed when we were looking at the cycle, we've seen the cycle in the book of Judges, right? But there was one thing different about the cycle that happens in this story, or that's a part of this story of Samson. Does anyone remember what it was? Yeah, thank you, Mel, remember.
All right.
Yeah, so remember the cycle? They fall into idolatry. Then God sends an oppressor, and they suffer judgment and oppression. They cry out in misery. God has compassion upon them, and he sends a judge who delivers them. They fall into idolatry. And so those are the steps in the cycle. But in the story of Samson, the one that was missing was when they were under the oppression of the Philistines, they didn't cry out. All before, they were like, oh, these Moabites, it's so terrible. Oh, these Midianites, it's terrible living under them. But when they're under the thumb of the Philistines, they were like, oh, well. That's the way it is. Right? They had just come to accept and live in misery. Look again at verses 10 through 13. So this is now when the Philistines have sent their army over to Judah, and the Judahites have mustered their army. And so at verse 10, the people of Judah asked, why have you come to fight us? We've come to take Samson prisoner, they answered, to do to him as he did to us. Then 3,000 men from Judah went down to the cave in the rock of Etam and said to Samson, don't you realize that the Philistines are rulers over us? What have you done to us? He answered, I merely did to them what they did to me. They said to him, we've come to tie you up and hand you over to the Philistines. Samson said, swear to me that you won't kill me yourselves. Agreed, they answered. We will only tie you up and hand you over to them. We will not kill you. So they bound him with 2 new ropes and led him up from the rock. When the Philistines come marching against the Judahites, here the Judahites who have fought valiantly in the past, who have done on other occasions what God commanded them to do. But what now is their attitude and feeling about it? The Philistines are rulers over us. Don't you realize that? If the Philistines are attacking, we shouldn't pray to God and ask him to give us victory and go out and fight and expect him to give us the conquest that he promised. We shouldn't follow the leader that he has raised up and on whom he has put his spirit, Samson, and follow Samson and go to war. We got to find Samson and tie him up and turn him over so something bad doesn't happen to us. You see what these Judahites have fallen into? How they have accepted this oppression? Now that in their mind is the normal state, and that's what they're supposed to have happen.
Did you notice too that 3,000 Israelites came to get Samson, and only 1,000 were the ones that he killed? There were already 3,000 of them when the Philistines came in the army, but they were so affected that these 3,000 men, instead of fighting right there, came in and got Samson. And Samson himself fought to only 1,000 people.
Yeah, I think that's probably significant, Cheryl. We don't know how big the Philistine army was, but by mentioning that Judah has an army of 3,000 alone just coming to get Samson is a little bit of a hint that they weren't like this tiny little helpless band. They had some force there, but they weren't using it. In their mindset, in their attitude, they were defeated. They had a defeatist attitude. And have you known people like that in life? People who accept that their situation is just so bad that they can't see anything beyond that. I had this in counseling all the time. Counseling is highly overrated. Did you know that? They say the success rate in counseling is somewhere in the neighborhood of about 25%, where somebody goes to see a counselor and they receive counsel and advice, support, encouragement, and they go and do better. That means somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 out of 4 people go see the counselor and they don't get better or even get worse. Well, I can perfectly understand that because I saw something probably similar to that. There were some people that the only reason they went to a counselor, the only reason they came to see the chaplain or would go see a psychologist or something is to be able to say they tried. Yeah, my wife and I, it just didn't work. It was never meant to be. We never should have got together. And we were having troubles, but we went and saw a counselor, but it just never was. They weren't working at it. They didn't see the counselor so they could heal their marriage. They saw the counselor so that they could tell everybody, Yeah, we tried counseling. It didn't work for us, so that, see, we shouldn't have gotten married. And people with life problems too. So I'd have some folks come in and they were so down. Everything is bad in my life. I got this problem, and they could enumerate all their problems. They had the spiel memorized, like they had gone through it in their mind 1,000 times. I told them, so this is what's wrong, this is what's wrong, this is my problem, this is my other problem. And they'd go through it all, and you'd start to say, okay, well, what does Scripture say about that? Or how can we think differently? Let's try. Or what about behavior modification? How can we see the way you handle this differently? Right. There's no hope going there for some people because they are so caught up and stuck in their problem.
And if you ask them, can you find any blessing that God has given you today? They can't. And then you say, did you eat? Well, that's a blessing.
But that just, it's futile to go there with them because they won't. You're exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've tried that too. I've done in counseling. Say, okay, you got all these problems. Let's look at your positives. Let's look at the positive side of the ledger. And there's some people that they start to see like, yeah, I guess I got to realize that I've got a lot going for me. But there's others that they don't want to even go there. It's just no use. So it's great in these stories here from Judges how you see human character and human nature is no different today than it was back then. Same kinds of things going on. Look at verse 14. So they've bound up Samson, and they're bringing him in verse 14 as he approached Lehi. The Philistines came toward him shouting, now they're going to get their revenge. Now they can see what's going to happen here. They're all excited. But the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. So we've seen that many times before, right? The Spirit of the Lord. Can you think of some places in the book of Judges already where we've seen that? I wrote them down for you there in case you don't remember.
Gideon.
Yeah, the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, right? The Spirit of the Lord came upon Othniel. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. The Spirit of the Lord stirred Samson in the first Samson story we saw. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him when he beat the lion. And here the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him as he does this fight with the jawbone. So you're seeing here when the Spirit of the Lord comes upon someone, they have this tremendous, maybe the right way to say it is tremendous outcomes result from it. For Samson, it's the supernatural strength, but the focus really is on what happens on the outcome. So when you get to the New Testament and you get to if these stories of deliverers, if these are antitypes for the consummate deliverer, Jesus Christ, what happens when you read about Jesus Christ and he says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, quoting from Isaiah? You see how being steeped in the Scriptures, knowing all of these stories, how much more full it makes the story of Jesus as you hear about Jesus. So you've read the book of Judges now, and you've read all these stories where when the Spirit comes upon somebody, great things happen. And then all of a sudden when you read about Jesus, Jesus says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. Wow, waiting for great things to happen. This is going to be very exciting. And so he finds he rips the ropes off his arms, they drop right off, and he finds the jawbone of a donkey. I'm trying to think, there's that old movie of Samson. I wonder if it's the one with Victor Mature. Anyway, it's kind of a neat scene in the movie because the Philistines have him tied up and they're marching him back to Philistia. He's surrounded by the Philistines and they're all happy and they're cheering, and they have like a little court jester guy who has like a skull of a donkey. And so as they're walking, and Samson's walking with his hands tied, the little jester guy is like coming up going, with the donkey, right? it's a way of mocking him and making fun of him. And it starts to rain, and then when Samson gets his strength and rips the things, he grabs the donkey, tears the jawbone off, and that's what he's using. We don't know that that's the way it happened, but it's kind of a good image, right? So look at verse 16, very interesting. In our text here, it says, "Then Samson said, with a donkey's jawbone, I have made donkeys of them. With a donkey's jawbone, I have killed 1,000 men." But you see a little footnote, right? So go down to the footnotes. Do you see the footnotes? Is everybody with me?
Mm-hmm.
So in footnote A, Judges 15:16, or this could be translated, or made a heap or two. Why? Because the Hebrew for donkey sounds like the Hebrew for heap. Ah, yes. So it's I think the fancy word is a paranomasia or something like that, but we would call it a pun, where you have a word that sounds the same but can have different meanings. So I was trying to think of one driving over here this morning so I could share with you. But imagine I said to you, I was out in the hot sun all day digging a new well. And after being out there to dig that well all day, I finally came out and I wasn't feeling very well. See the word well? It's used in two different senses there, so there's a little
Live
play.
and live.
Say it again?
Live and live. Like live bake or live bake.
Yeah. I think you could do that. Live and live. Yeah. That you could do that with that, right? Sometimes paranomasia words sound the same. Sometimes they're spelled the same. So there's probably a special English
Think
word
about
for what that
Then
is.
you go by a place where you have fishing, and they say live bait.
Live bait, yeah.
Live bait.
Yeah, good. So that's what's happening here. So the word for donkey and the word for a heap are they're the same. So in this particular text, I think this is NIV, he says, with a donkey's jawbone, I have made donkeys of them. So he's translating the word as donkey both times. There are some texts that do that. But others would say, with a donkey's jawbone, I have made them into a heap. And there's one translation that actually kind of captures the poetry and the rhyming of it. It's pretty good. Moffat's translation, and it says, with the jawbone of an ass, I have piled them in a mass. Isn't that great?
That's clever. Very
Yeah.
clever, yeah.
And that kind of, but that gets at what's going on here, doesn't it? So, I mean, Samson's having fun with this. He just killed 1,000 guys, and you just get this sense of like, and the Hebrews reading this years later, how are they going to read it? Like, oh, those poor Philistines. Oh, the horrible violence. We might have to rate this R for violence. No. They're like, this is cool. This is great. Samson killed 1,000 Philistines, and then he's making jokes about it. It's great. Because these are their oppressors. By the way, I've said before, I don't know if we know this, but you can see in several other places, and so I've mentioned this in this class before, that it's quite possible that the book of Judges is maybe either being written or compiled by Samuel. And who were the primary enemies of the Israelites in the times of Samuel? Remember? Yeah, that'd be a good guess. The Philistines, right? Remember Saul had to fight the Philistines, and then the Philistines came out with Goliath, and who's going to fight? David fought against the Philistines. So they're reading this story at the time it was likely written, and this is a very real enemy for them. So they see the humor in this pun. Look at verse 17. When he finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone, and the place was called Ramath Lehi. And there's a footnote there. B, Ramoth Lehi means Jawbone Hill, right? So the place was already called Lehi, now it becomes called the Jawbone Hill. And then there, at the end, there's this little addition to the story in verses 18 and 19. Because he was very thirsty, he cried out to the Lord, "You have given your servant this great victory. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" So what do you think of his Samson's faith at this point? Dawn mentioned it earlier.
Well, not his faith, but it's hard enough to kill one man. It's physically demanding. And he killed 1,000 men. I mean, swinging that, whatever he was doing with that thing, that took it all, you know.
Jawbone, by the way, as I understand it, I'm not an expert at this stuff, but they say the donkey's jawbone can be a very lethal weapon because it's narrow at the bottom and then it's big, kind of up in the upper part of the jaw. So you grab that thing like that, it's kind of like a club, and that's what he does in the movie, right? The Philistines have these metal helmets on, and as they're charging at Samson, he's got the thing like this, and he's like boom, and you see the guy's head cave in, boom, this guy's head caves in,
Yeah,
boom.
but just think of doing that 1,000 times.
Yeah.
And so he's
Sure, he's thirsty.
really thirsty and worn out.
And have you ever been thirsty? I know what it's like to be really thirsty. When I worked at a tree nursery years and years ago, and I was sent out to one of the outlying fields, and there's no water there, and so usually you'd bring your own water. You bring a big jug of water or something like that because you're gonna be out there all day. I forgot. My wife was not surprised. I forget stuff a lot. It's not unusual for me. So I worked out in the 90-something degree sun in dry dust all day, and to the point where I'm really lucky I didn't faint up there and just die. And then someone came to pick me up at 4 o'clock, and he saw me and he said, "Hey, I got one of these little juice boxes. You want?" And I one slurp, it was gone. I never tasted anything so good. I would have drunk water from a puddle or something if it was there. You get so thirsty. So it's no joke being thirsty. And this is in the Middle East where it's hot and it's dry. But there's something else going on here too that I think we should see. Take those Bibles. Would you hand me one of those? Let's look over at Exodus chapter 17.
Or did you finger?
Exodus 17. All the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of Sheen by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? They're almost ready to stone me." And the Lord said to Moses, "Pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go, behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel, and he called the name of the place Massah, or Meribah, because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, because they tested the Lord by saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Now, just flip over to Numbers chapter 20. Numbers 20. Look at verse 2. Now there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron, and the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Would that we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness, that we should die here, both we and our cattle? And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It is no place for grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, and there's no water to drink." Then Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces. The glory of the Lord appeared to them, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother. Tell the rock before in their eyes to yield its water, so you shall bring water out of the rock for them, and give drink to the congregation and their cattle. And Moses took the staff from before the Lord as he commanded him. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their livestock. So here we see that twice in the history of Israel, once coming out of Egypt to Horeb before the Ten Commandments happened, and then another time later, they had no water to drink, and they complained before the Lord, we have no water to drink. And so God provided water by having water come out of a rock. Now here's Samson, thirsty, and he cries out to the Lord, You've given your servant this great victory. Must I now die of thirst? So what's he doing? He's complaining to the Lord that why'd you bring me out here? And then I don't have any water. And then God opened up the hollow place in Lehi, and water came out of it. So something opens up, right? Just like striking the rock and water comes out. And then Samson drank, and his strength returned, and he revived. So the spring was called En-Hakkore, and is still there in Lehi to this day. So what's happening? You're seeing that in the life of Samson, the same things are occurring that occurred in the life of Israel. I've mentioned this to you before. You remember? Samson was attracted to what kind of women? Foreign women. And God had said, don't be attracted to these foreign women. What happened to Israel? God said to Israel, don't marry these foreign women. And when they worshiped the foreign women, or went with the foreign women, they ended up worshiping the foreign women's gods, and they fell into idolatry. And God calls that, he specifically speaks of it as adultery, that when they worship a foreign god, they're committing adultery against their true God. So what we see happening in the life of Samson is, I think, intended to be a picture for us of what was happening in the life of the nation of Israel. So we see Samson with all his faults. Remember I told you the spiral? And how so far of all the heroes, all of the judges, who's got the most problems of all of them so far? Samson. And we see that Samson is a picture of the nation of Israel. Israel has had this, the Spirit work on it. Israel's been used in mighty ways by God, and yet Israel keeps having all these problems, just like Samson keeps having all these problems. Now, what would that say to you if you were a part of Israel and you're reading this? Well, should make you feel contrition and repentance. Boy, we've done wrong. It's like looking in a mirror, right? You're reading a story about someone that, in that story, you should see yourself. You should say, boy, I've done wrong. But God still works through Samson, and God still brings about these tremendous victories. So God hasn't given up on me. God is still going to do great things. Now, isn't that great for an Israelite reading this story in the days of Samuel? But guess what? What about you reading it in the year 2018? Who's the nation of Israel now?
Yeah.
The church. Yeah. Who's God's covenant people now? The church. So as you read this story, what should you do? You're looking in a mirror too. You should look back on your life and say, I've disobeyed God too. I've grumbled against God too, but that I didn't think he was providing for me right, or he wasn't giving me what I should have. And yet I have gone after things that I shouldn't go after. I've loved things that I shouldn't have loved. And yet God hasn't given up on me. Yet God's covenant with me is still sure and certain. So you can see something contemporary in this for yourself, that this story still applies to us. Well, thank you so much for being here. May the Lord watch over you all this week, and I hope you can come back again next week as we look at the last section of the story of Samson and Delilah. Thank you, everybody.